WPSL.com.
How are U.S. TV series doing in reflecting the true ethnic and racial makeup of America? A new set of rankings tries to answer that question.
How's Dion doing?
Raising Dion on Netflix about a black mother and son had the highest score.
We need a new approach.
Also on Netflix, Gentified about Mexican-American cousins scored high as well.
It's time to focus on family.
Broadcast and cable series that top the list include Queen Sugar on the Oprah Winfrey Network about black siblings in Louisiana.
The woman fell from the cliff.
And HBO's The Baby. The list from USC's Annenberg Inclusion Initiative and the Adobe Foundation ranked shows on their diversity and inclusion on screen and behind the scenes. Wendy Gillette, CBS News.
And finally, Britain's Queen has selected a once scandalous thriller for her monthly book club. The Lord's Day has the royal family taken hostage. Author Michael Dobbs, who wrote the original House of Cards, says the choice shows Queen Camilla's a tremendous sport. I'm Vicki Barker, CBS News.
WPTV's First Alert Weather on WPSL is brought to you by Seacoast Air Conditioning. Family owned and operated on the Treasure Coast since 1982. Online at seacoastair.com. Now with a look at our forecast, here's meteorologist Steve Villanueva.
Hey there everyone, Steve Villanueva here. So we do go partly sunny as the day goes on. Highs in the lower 80s. It's going to be a breezy one. Now for the weekend, here comes a front. It's going to stall on top of us and it will cool us off. By the time we get to Sunday, we're in the lower 70s, but we're mostly cloudy both Saturday and Sunday. Could pick up some showers and storms, and especially Saturday night into Sunday morning, we could see some locally heavy downpours. Some models hinting that a few inches of rain possible. I'm WPTV First Alert meteorologist Steve Villanueva for WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
Living in Florida is paradise until your AC breaks down. We answer the phones, show up on time, and fix the problem right the first time.
Comfort crisis, don't roast, call Seacoast.
Hi, this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb, inviting you to join us at Congregation Eitz Chayim, your Jewish home on the Treasure Coast. We are inclusive, we are welcoming, we are all things Jewish on the Treasure Coast. We have Kabbalat Shabbat services at Friday evenings at 7:30 p.m. Our sanctuary is at 295 Northwest Prima Vista Boulevard at the corner of Irving in St. Andrews Community Center. Please join us there any Friday. On third Fridays, we have a Shabbat dinner at 6:15 p.m. Reservations can be made at our website, www.eitzchayim.org. You can stay up to date with us at our website or on Facebook. Lots of different ways to check in with Congregation Eitz Chayim. Again, a welcoming, inclusive Jewish home on the Treasure Coast, just for you to join us and enjoy your Jewishness and renew your inner Jew at Congregation Eitz Chayim.
This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It's 10:07 at WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast. Ask an aviator, an engineer, an author, a painter, and a rabbi.
All right.
You are so versatile.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So, yeah. And this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb of Congregation Eitz Chayim, your Jewish home on the Treasure Coast.
I left out professor.
That's true. And I can't spell Ask a Rabbi, so I'm in real problems today.
You're really in trouble.
I'm having this technology challenge moment today.
Oh, we've had it all week.
You know, and I thought that Mercury retrograde was supposed to be over, but apparently it's still thinking about it.
Yeah.
Cliff is saying, no, you're not even close.
Oh.
Huh?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You eat them. Okay.
Well, and you know, it just some stupid stuff to go along with that. You know, Cliff was having a lot of problems bringing our game in the other night, and you know, and nothing had changed except dummy me decides to put the wrong date on the Zoom invite. It's like, human error.
Yeah, one of those times.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Crazy. So other than that, how did this week go for you?
Well, it was the first week of classes at both Kaiser and at IRSC. So lots of new students to get to know. And big classes at Kaiser, and by that I mean a whopping 8 to 13 students. But
yeah, it's a pretty intimate little school.
It's wonderful if you like small classes, which I do. I like both. Okay, candidly.
See, I can't function in a large environment. I mean, I really liked most of my classes at Loyola were around 12 to 15 people.
Yeah.
And, except for like freshman English, and that's 300 or 400. But yeah. I think I'd really like that even lower student total of 6 to 8. That sounds intriguing.
Well, it because of the way that Kaiser does now at Flagship, they do larger classes in a more traditional university model, but at all the other campuses,
sure, yeah,
they do the 1 month intensive. So students typically go to class 3 days a week for 4 hours a day.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And it's a very intense kind of model. And that's fine. It's absolutely fine. And it works really well for students. They dig deep into a subject, they concentrate on that subject, and they gain mastery in it. It's just a different approach. And I think it works quite well.
IRSC, your normal, what, 20 to 30 type?
40.
40?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. The class at IRSC is typically 40 students and typically meets for the 12 to 13 weeks of a semester.
Wow.
And, it meets once or twice a week, depending on the class format. The classes that I teach there are both hybrid and online. So I have classes that are purely online and classes that are.
And a memo to all the other college presidents in the state of Florida. Another Dr. Moore earthquake is coming. The promise is back again.
Okay.
Yeah. So one more year of the promise, free education, folks, for kids in St. Lucie, Martin, Indian River, and Okeechobee counties.
If they qualify.
If they qualify, yeah. Well, you have to have decent grades. Yeah.
Well, and they have to have been recently graduated.
Well, yeah. Yeah,
right.
sure.
So it's not for everybody.
No.
It's not a free college. It's
I gotcha.
Right. It's a grant that's aimed at certain target group of students to help boost. Actually, one of the things that I've been asking classes today or this week has been how many people in St. Lucie County have a college degree.
Oh, that's that. Wow.
And what do you think that number is, sir?
I'll bet it's low.
Somewhere in the area of 20 to 25%.
I'm surprised it's that high.
Yeah. Well, you start to realize that some of those are AAs.
Oh, well, then that's a little different story.
Yeah. Right. So when we say a college degree, that doesn't mean what,
I thought you meant
you and I would call a college degree.
Okay, like a BA or a master's.
But we're not talking bachelor's and higher. We're talking the beginning of college.
Okay.
Now a lot of people get associate degrees. There's a lot of people in that category. It'd be a good question to ask the statistics. What percentage of people have a bachelor's or higher? And that probably is much lower.
Yeah. But I would imagine if you looked at the entire state of Florida, it would be like that.
I'm sure that it is, especially in some areas.
Yeah.
Higher tends to be higher in and around cities and lower in more rural areas.
Sure.
Because if somebody's going to grow up and do the family farm, while they would benefit from an agricultural degree or a business degree, they may not see it as that important.
Well, it's interesting. I was talking with one of our assistant coaches who is his full-time job is at Fort Pierce Central, and they have a tie with Embry-Riddle University.
Mm-hmm.
And he said there are now, as of this semester, 9 students in the aeronautical engineering department at Fort Pierce Central. They're going to scoot straight into either Embry-Riddle or a military academy. It's as simple as that. You know, it's like, wow. But those are really the best of the best.
Yeah, I think I actually have one aeronautical student in one of my classes. I asked the students in general what programs they're in both schools. And it's because of what I teach, it's usually a very diverse group, which is always interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the guys on the basketball team were all in seventh heaven. And I mean, they're taking some big time college courses. And
as they should.
3.69 was the average GPA. That's great.
Not bad. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially since in college, a lot of people don't even shoot for A's. Actually. Yeah.
That's interesting because that's all Carol used to shoot at.
Well, of course, where you shoot is really a significant part of where you end up.
Yeah.
People seldom overshoot their target.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. So if your goal is a B, then most people don't work and get an A just because they can. They stop working when they realize they've achieved the B.
Right. Yeah, I told my mom I'd get a B and bang. Okay.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when they have the B, right, so it's almost as if your target is your upper limit. It's not like it's concentric circles that you're trying to hit close to. It's a top limit typically. Right, so there's a ceiling slightly above it that you might overshoot a little bit, but in general, most people either ricochet against that ceiling and come down somewhere, and sometimes below their target.
Are you noticing a little bit less of the COVID problems of the past in education?
Well, I think that students are getting used to coming back to class.
There you go. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Yeah.
Although one of the things that we talked about in the cognition class yesterday, and this was actually, one of the classes I teach at Kaiser this term is Intro to Cognition. And cognition is an interesting thing. It's how you think, right? It's the process in your head. And that is we are very complex creatures, and we have just begun to really map the parts of the brain that do different functions. So there's one part. We see through our eyes, the image comes through the lenses and paints on the retina, but at the back of the retina, there's a nerve, a neuron, that goes to the back, to the occipital lobe, which is actually in the back part of our head. So it travels the full distance of our brain. But that's by far not the longest neurons. The longest neurons are in your toes. Right, because their axons go all the way down and then have a feedback loop all the way back to your head, which is why it may take you a second. You may react long before you process the information coming in through your toes.
Interesting. Okay.
Because it's got to travel that distance. Now it's very fast, and the body has ways of speeding up certain neurons. And so the information we get through our ears is actually processed right above them, and the nasal processing is not far from it, but the eyes are very far. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Right. So perception happens back here, not up here. What you see is not necessarily what you get, because we have to process it. So what we were talking about yesterday in class is a disorder called prosopagnosia, which it's hard to say it fast. Prosopagnosia.
Can you say that on the radio?
Yes, you can.
Oh, okay.
It means the inability to recognize faces.
Oh, I'm terrible at that.
Well, and some people are. It's the ability to remember faces when you've seen them before.
You know, what's really amazing is that Tommy Lasorda, he not only remembered faces, he remembered like wives' names, kids' names. He knew the names of both of our kids. It's like, wow.
Some people can store that information. There are what they call super recognizers.
Okay,
And those
there
are
you
people
go.
who perhaps never lose a face. They may have seen you 10 years ago in a supermarket, talked to you briefly, and now have you locked in.
Just the way he was. Yeah.
So there are people like that. I worked with a woman at when I was teaching Hebrew school in Cleveland who could walk through a room with 150 people she'd never met before, and after that she would be able to call them by name.
Oh my gosh.
She would introduce herself to everybody, get their name, and she could store it. She never again had to ask. So that's a super recognizer. That's somebody who really has that part of their brain well developed, well honed, and well connected to it, to the memory.
So
Most of us fall somewhere in between. But
okay, so how many out of 1 million people are like that? That's amazing.
There's not many that are super recognizers. Some are better than others, and some are worse. I'm not all that good with names. I'm pretty good at saying, I've seen you before, I know you, but after time it fades for the most part, but not everybody. There are some faces that I can recognize. Brad Pitt's probably one of the best known people with prosopagnosia. He can look at a face and he can tell that you're a face, but he can't recognize you.
Really?
Yeah, he may have worked with you, he may have met you 5 minutes ago, and the next time he comes across you, he won't be able to pick you out of a crowd.
Have we ever met?
Well,
Wow.
and so he tends to be very sheltered because of the embarrassment that brings with it in our society. He knows that you have 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. He might even know that you have big floppy ears, but he won't be able to remember that he can sometimes anchor in on a feature and hold that with somebody, but not faces.
Wow.
And that's
amazing for an actor. I mean, wow.
He can act. It doesn't impair any other part
Yeah.
of your brain. It's a very specific small area located, it's right back in here somewhere.
The back of your head.
The back of your head. And so it's not far from that where you do visual perception. And we're not born with it. That's one of the misnomers when you pick up Facebook and you get the popular stuff. Some people think you're born with it. We're not born with the fusiform. It's called the fusiform face area. Nancy Canwisher of MIT's done a lot of work in locating it and in figuring out how it works, as have a number of other neuroscientists, neurobiologists, and or neuropsychologists rather, I'm sorry, that deal with how we process information in our brain. It is something, however, we are wired to learn, but only in the early stages of life.
All right. So folks at MIT are developing all these robots.
That's part of that department is the
Really?
Yeah, because they're trying to figure out how the brain calculates it.
Yeah.
Because
well,
if you can figure out how the brain does its calculations, then you can model it and imitate it. But facial recognition is done differently on a computer than it's done in person. And the best way that they showed, that there was a 60 Minutes piece where they interviewed 4 people who had the disorder. And one of them, they showed her a picture of her daughter and she could not recognize her daughter.
Oh,
So sometimes what some of these people will do is they will anchor in, say, to a hairstyle or some other quality to you that they can remember. They actually can't tell the difference between faces. And one of the ways that they model this for normal processing people, for normal, typical, neurotypical processors is to show a face upside down. And if you see a face upside down without hair, you probably won't recognize it.
I wouldn't.
Most people wouldn't. And that's the way that they tell you what it's like.
This almost, the way you describe this almost sounds like dementia-like.
It sounds like it, but it's not.
Okay.
Because it can happen to a 13-year-old.
Yeah.
Right? It happens to a child. And all of the other processing is still there.
Now, is there a lineage in this type of thing, like mom or dad?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Wow.
No. So far, they have not found a heritability quality to it. What they do find that influences it a lot is how many faces you see as an infant. Not as a toddler, but as an infant. And we also know that babies don't have good vision when they're first born, but they're pretty quick to start to lock in on eyes and faces. So the wiring to make us look at faces is pretty early. And when you see faces, which every child does, or almost every child does, they start to figure out what are the differences between faces.
Mm-hmm. I got you.
But here's the piece and why it plays in. If all of the faces that you see are mom and dad, you're not going to get good at telling other people's faces.
Okay.
Now, recognize that as the infant grows, typically they do see other people. They see the doctors, the nurses. When they go for checkups, they see people in the market when they go with mom or dad shopping. So they get to see lots of different faces. But in COVID, that wasn't true for the babies born right at the beginning of the shutdown.
Lockdown.
So it'll be interesting to see if we have a blip of people who are not good at recognizing faces. But it's much too early to know that.
Wow. That's amazing.
And the reason I can say that is because of the work of Dr. Canwisher and her colleagues. One of them took primates. You can't do this with humans because it's not ethical. But for primates that you're always going to have, that you're always going to care for, it's not as critical if they can't recognize who's who in their colony or among their handlers. But they raised them so that they didn't see faces for 6 months.
Whoa.
Just, in a certain way that they
Yeah.
couldn't see faces. And they found that this facial recognition area of their brains was not developed. So it needs the stimuli of faces. And so one of the reasons that and I don't know the reason why Brad Pitt has it, but perhaps he had an infection as a young child and didn't get to see many people. Or something else interfered with that part of his brain forming. Sometimes people get brain damage in that area.
Can you get this back?
No.
Oh.
No. The odds of learning it are really hard. What they try to do with people who have it is they try to teach them something like noses or to get them to hone in on one thing rather than trying to process the face.
Wow.
And, and there's been some progress with that, but very often what these individuals need is somebody to tell them and the people around them to clue. So, for example, if you say to them, I'm your spouse, then they will be able to act accordingly. They know that they're married. They just may not recognize you in a crowd. Remember, this woman couldn't even recognize her own daughter. So very often what people who have this will do is they'll get their kids to say, wear a barrette or a hairpiece or something else that they can lock in with the memory of who the person is.
Oh my gosh.
You'll see also where people will get out of a car and wave at their kids so that their kids recognize them. So there's all kinds of compensation. Sometimes it's considered to be visual problems, and it may be. It may be that they're blurry and they just can't make out the details quite as well as they should. So there's lots that's going into this, and our ability to analyze it and figure out how to help the people afflicted with it is just really at its infancy. It's very real. We know that there's people who have this. We know that other cases of it, and it has to do with how many faces the baby sees.
That's fascinating.
Unless there's brain damage, right? Because it's a very small area of your brain, and if you have an aneurysm there, or God forbid, some projectile goes through you, it can take out that area. And then it becomes very difficult. It's not that they see faces, they just can't make out the difference between your eyes and Carol's eyes and Cliff's eyes.
Wow.
And it's very hard for normally processing people to understand that. They just don't get they might in the moment say, okay, I'm looking at you and I can see that you have reddish brown eyebrows with a little bit of gray in them.
Or a lot of gray in my case. You're being polite.
So I might see that, but I might not remember that 2 weeks down the road when I see it. Okay. The super recognizers, interestingly, can also recognize pictures of children and who they grow up to be. So, and they did this piece on one of the ones that we were looking at. They had a super recognizer on there, and she was able to recognize a picture of Wallace when he was Joe Wallace, when he was 6 years old.
Wow. It's so funny you say that. I remember on one of the NCIS shows, Carol and I are addicted to that show. Anyway, they had, they were looking for a suspect or something. And they did one of those traces from childhood to adulthood. This is what this person would look like in adulthood, and that was the case.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So people age in a certain way, and super recognizers can process that. But it's interesting when somebody is fleeing, when a suspect is hiding, one of the things that they do most often is change their hair color and style.
You see that on television all the time.
And you see it in real life. It's something that people do because it makes it easier for them. People lock in on these external features. They don't lock in on, you've got a nose shape of... Now, facial recognition software is really good at measuring your eyes, which are very, very distinct, and it measures a number of different things. And they get that from how people process. It's a little bit different, the way the computer does it. And I get a kick at Mr. Mevo here will occasionally say, oh, I think I see a face over there. And I'll look at the image that because it puts a circle up when it thinks it sees a face. And it has seen faces in things that have just amused me. But it triggers enough of its algorithm that it says, oh, is there a face there?
Interesting.
Nobody else would say that, but that same processing is how we see faces in a piece of toast, in the swirls of the blocks of glass. It's what's in our visual vocabulary, what artists call it your visual vocabulary. So it's the images that you keep in your brain of certain things, like what makes up a dog, what makes up. So when I was showing dogs, for example, when I was raising dogs and showing them, and very active with dogs, I could tell the ears of different breeds very quickly, or the tails of different breeds. I could
see that.
I got really good at just the little detail, and part of that was because I was making jewelry, and I had to be very precise about what was the difference between a full-size beagle and a miniature beagle. What were the differences between the different sizes of poodles? Because they are slightly different.
Oh, yeah.
They're not just larger and smaller. And so there are, interestingly, like Weimaraners and Vizslas actually bodily look the same, but their colors are different.
What was the second one?
Vizsla.
I've seen Weimaraners before.
Yeah, and they're both European breeds, but one is the silver gray, the Weimaraner.
Yeah.
And the Vizsla is a reddish brown.
Huh. Do they have the pointy ears as well?
They all have the same.
Really?
actually drop ears.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, here's one you might not expect. We sometimes say that poodles are Dobermans in drag because they have similar body shapes. So those are the kinds.
Oh, come on.
Very similar body shape for the conformation of a show, not for the pet market, but for the ones that are shown. And there's a difference in the build of dogs that are sold in the pet market and dogs that are used for showing.
Like thinner bodies, if you will.
Well, so let's talk about poodles. Some pet poodles tend to be a little bit long and low on the leg, whereas the show poodles are very high on the leg. They form a square.
Yeah, ours were low.
That's the pet market.
Okay.
And,
Wow.
And they've diverged. So, yeah. And some people don't like the look of the show dogs because they're too tall. It's all in what you're accustomed to.
Sure.
And so how and what we see and do has a lot to do. It speaks to why it's important for babies to have as many diverse experiences as possible. It's going to help them build all of these early forming parts of their brain. And I know I've said it other times, have colorful things in the child's environment. Have a color mobile over the crib.
We got
Have,
those for the grandkids.
have things for kids to grab that are bright and colorful. The more they have in their environment, the better these parts of their brain. Here's the most important thing you can do for a baby. Let's play peekaboo. Peekaboo. Because when you cover the eyes to an infant, you have disappeared. To their processing, you are not there. And what you're teaching them is that you are there.
Wow. Okay.
So you're teaching them a concept called object permanence, which babies don't have. They really are out of sight, out of mind. Wow. They haven't learned that if I put my cup down, the most likely place for my cup to be is where I left it. They don't understand that.
That the cup can move.
Well, and they also don't understand that it can stay.
Yeah, yeah.
If they're not looking at it, it's not there.
Wow. I never thought about that.
Here's another one that's kind of interesting. Can your child follow your finger when you point to something and figure out that's what they're supposed to do? That's called inference. That is also a learned thing. Now, here's a piece. Dogs can do it. You can point to something and the dog will follow it.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Ours
Right.
did.
Dogs are very capable of developing the concept of inference, and they develop it fairly early, largely because people point at treats and toys and things like that. So it helps them figure it out. But primates typically don't have it. And you might say, why is it that dogs and humans have it? Because we evolved together, and it's part of the communication that we do with our dogs.
It's interesting that we had on one of the Christmas kid shows here, the deputy who is a canine deputy, and he was talking about, of course, you know, that dog lives with his family. I mean, it's a family pet for them.
Right.
But then goes to work with him, you know. And he's like a bomb sniffing dog. And he's got all sorts of tests for that dog, even when he brings him home.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And I know you've said this maybe years ago about showing dogs, but there are certain breeds that are really, really intelligent.
Yeah, you can look up and see videos of a dog named Chaser that a retired psychologist, Dr. Pilley, raised and trained, and the dog has a vocabulary of over 1,000 different toys that she knows by name, and she knows the difference between get, drop, put, paw, and nose, and find. And she is capable of inference big time. So they do a test with her that you can see on the video. And what it is they have a new toy that they bring to her, one that she's not seen. He has cataloged all of the toys because he can't remember all of the names of the toys, but she can. She can.
God, the dog can, but the professor can't.
Yeah, and he's written the names of the toys on them. But somebody snuck in a new toy that she had not seen before, and they lay out 10 or 12 toys behind the couch. And he's sitting in the front of he's not the professor or the doctor, and the doctor's not behind the couch. The dog can't see the humans. And they tell her to bring 2 of the toys she knows, and she brings them. She grabs them correctly. And then they say, bring Darwin, which is the name of the toy, the new toy. And she sits there and she ponders for a long while. She actually comes back around and looks at him. She doesn't come full forward, but she looks at him over the arm of the couch. And he again says, find Darwin. And she goes in the back and she figures out which one's Darwin and brings it.
Oh my gosh.
It's the new one. It's the one she doesn't know.
And she figured that out.
And she figures that out. So her reasoning and her memory skills are off the charts. And it's not that she's a genius. It's that she was trained.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. When Dr. Pilley selected her out of the litter, he just picked one that he liked. He didn't give her any test to see which one was the brightest or the this or the that. He just took a dog and spent a lot of time. He said that he passed a few years ago, about just before the 20s. And he said that he would spend 2 to 3 hours a day educating her. He was retired, so that was his hobby.
Okay.
And he would work with her. He taught her to herd sheep. He taught her to do this. She puts her toys away. She's an incredibly tuned dog, and she spends a ton of time watching him.
Wow. You know, speaking of dogs, Carol and I love these commercials with this pet food that you put in the refrigerator. And there's some very funny commercials, why would you put dog food in a refrigerator, And
why not? It's where they come anyway, because they hear it opening.
That's right.
Even if you don't give them a treat, they still get a reward for coming to your fridge, because they get all those cool smells that come out of it when you open it. And their sense of smell is 100 times what ours is. I'm particularly amused to watch when I bring something in to the house, say something I've had at work, and I bring it in a bag or whatever, however I bring it home, whatever they can get to, they sniff like crazy, because they're getting information. They and the cats, they both sniff it. And it's funny, because I'll put a package down like on the sofa or something until I go to put it away, and I've got all the animals, clustered around it going, this is new, this is new, this isn't from the house, we know that.
That's so funny.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's part of what they get when they come up to you. They sniff you for a few minutes when you first come home to see where you've been.
Mm-hmm.
They're gathering that information. And it's also all the different things that they go nosing through. And they like different smells than what we like, clearly, because they like sniffing your shoes and your socks and things like that, because they smell really like you. And another of the doctors on one of the shows, one of the videos that talks about Chaser, talks about when dogs look at you and when you look at your dog, you both get a boost of oxytocin. And so that's a reward that you're hugging each other visually.
Nice.
And so here's a piece. That might be one of the things that's different in prosopagnosia. Probably don't get the oxytocin that says, oh, this is a friend. Wow. I hadn't thought about that till just now. But what I'm thinking of is when I come home, if I sit down any of the various places that I sit, including the bathroom, right? Because it's a popular place to go when you first get home. If I pick up my phone, if somebody texts me and I go to look at it, my dogs are very upset because they don't get to make eye contact with me. And I can see out of the corner of my eye over my phone, the tail go down and the ears go, and they leave. Yeah.
No.
So
Whoa.
I try to be really mindful to not look when I first sit down and give them a few minutes of eye contact.
Wow.
It's important. And the same, I'm sure, is true with your kids. I don't have small children at home to test that theory out, but all of the people who are locked on their phones all day are robbing their kids of eye contact.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So once again, peekaboo, very, very important to play with kids. Put lots of color and faces and different people. I'm not saying toss your kid around to strangers. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is just expose them, let them see, let them take in. Let them hear different things, let them hear different languages so they don't lose the ability to make those sounds.
It's funny you talk about the screens. Our assistant women's coach, we're about, maybe an hour out of Miami. And she said, okay, kids, put away the phones and let's just start thinking. And it was really interesting because that's the first time I'd seen that happen. And you think, okay, this is interesting. Now they've got him doing something other than just looking at a screen.
And again, the earlier we do that, parents are unfortunately giving screens to kids earlier and earlier.
It's awful.
And until the brain is developed, it's dangerous. It really is. There was Star Trek, of all the places to go. I think it was The Next Generation, Wesley, whichever series he was in.
Okay.
He was with the Jean-Luc Picard, right? Am I right?
Yeah, that would have been,
So that would have been
the later one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's one episode where they have a game that goes in, and the game takes over the minds of the people who play it.
Wow.
And Roddenberry, in some ways, was so far ahead of his time and so intuitive in so many of these things. But that was an interesting piece, right, where they all pick up this game, and I think it's Wesley's mother who figures it out by what it does to Wesley.
Well, and you think of their walkie-talkies that had pictures.
Yeah, they look amazingly like iPhones.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Smartphones, yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But on the other hand, Dick Tracy had watches.
That's right.
That look an awful lot like an Apple Watch.
Uh-huh. That's right. Yeah. Just 100 years earlier.
Yeah. And if you really want to see something interesting, it's figure out all the things that your phone knows about you.
I don't want to know that.
Yeah. Well, it knows everywhere you've been.
Yes.
Right, because it's sitting there going tick, 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 tick. It figures out.
Oh, yeah. On a daily basis, here's a memory of whatever.
Yeah. It knows where you've been, what you've done. And I don't know what its recycle rate is, how much memory it holds on to, but it does that for quite a while.
Or is that all up in the cloud now?
Well, I'm sure it uploads some of it into the cloud. For example, it keeps the geographic information on your pictures.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So it'll tell you, oh, this is your trip to the Caribbean. My phone does that all the time for me. It says, here's a movie of the photos you took in the Caribbean. From this year and the year before and the year before that. And here we put it together for you. We put the sunsets together, and we've done. So the phone is constantly learning about you and using that quote unquote to give you a better experience. And it's fun and interesting, but realize that that information is stored somewhere. Accessible to the phone, and as my good friend likes to say, BCC, various government agencies.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And
sure.
So we are interesting, complex creatures. And that's true of our kids too. And we can definitely help them. And it does make a difference how and what happens to you before the age of 25. Your brain is not fully developed until 25. It really would be, in many ways, much smarter if we didn't allow people to drink until they were 25. Not that it would stop people from sneaking drinks and lying and all of that, but it would lower the number. Because the more we interfere with that development of the brain, it only takes a couple of brewskis, and you start destroying parts of your brain.
Sure. Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think we are seeing as a country the effect of people who can't figure out consequences, can't do some of the normal processing because parts of their brain have been damaged in ways, or altered, maybe not damaged, but altered.
Yeah, I believe that.
So one of the questions that I sometimes get is why are things like autism on the rise? And the answer is that we are doing more things, and the definition of what is neurodivergent has also increased. So it's gotten broader. We recognize more things because people very often compensate. So people who don't have good navigation skills, their iPhone can help. You can ask, not just iPhones, any smartphone. You can ask a smartphone, where am I? And it will tell you. You ask it, how do I get from here, where I am, to home? It'll tell you. How do I get to the supermarket? It'll tell you. So it takes over a lot of those kinds of functions. So people don't use their brains to do it. And the side part of that is they don't learn what it takes to do it.
To do it for themselves.
Which is especially important when you're talking about young people.
Yeah.
Because navigation is an important part of our brains. And again, it's highly localized, highly specialized. It's deep inside the brain, the part of us that navigates. For some people who've not had to navigate, if they were taken everywhere by hand as a small child and they didn't have to go anywhere, they didn't develop that part of their brain. If they had to navigate, then they started to pick it up and develop it unless something damages it. And so there are people who have that inability. Now, it doesn't stop them from being able to, say, draw a crab. They can draw a crab perfectly and put all the pieces in the right place. But if you ask them to draw a picture of the house they live in, if they have that disorder, then the house will not look like the house they're in.
Wow.
So there's all kinds of little bits and pieces that different people have. And some of it turns into creativity, but some of it doesn't. Some of it just turns into, I've got to cope with this. So, for example, I don't have really good depth perception, which is interesting because I fly, right? I don't fly now, but I used to teach flying, right? And it may have even played into some of my fear of heights that I had for a while. I have worked through that one. I've exposed myself enough to heights to get over my fear of heights.
Wait a minute. Time out. How does a pilot have a fear of heights?
Because in the airplane, I can't fall far.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So one of the things that so here was my coping mechanism, okay? Fear of heights. I didn't like climbing on top of the airplane to check it. And so as a flight instructor, you teach your students to pre-flight to check the airplane. And my students would always have to do that from the second lesson on. And I had just gotten out of the airplane. I was reasonably sure it was in good shape. Okay. So I would come back out, sit down in the plane and let them pre-flight it. And they would come into the cockpit and they would say, aren't you going to double check me? And I'd say, no, I showed you what to do last lesson. Did you do it? If you want to get back out and do it again, feel free. I will not hold that against you. Just next time do it knowing I'm not going to do it. And it taught the students to be responsible from the beginning.
Wow.
So my coping mechanism actually worked out as a good teaching moment.
Oh, good grief. Okay.
But yeah, so I very seldom did a pre-flight. If I was flying with anybody and they offered to check it, I trusted them more than I trusted me climbing up over the top of the airplane.
Huh. Wow. That's interesting.
And the one time that I will say that something went funky was an item that wasn't on the pre-flight list. And interestingly, it was with my husband. I was giving him twin engine instruction. He was working on his twin engine certification. And the Cessna we were flying had just come out of maintenance. And the mechanic released it. We were good to go. My husband went out, did the pre-flight, checked everything, and he's meticulous on stuff like that. He's really good and detailed. We hop in the airplane, we take off, and I look out over the right wing, and I see oil coming up over.
Oh, no.
And I look at him very calmly, and I say, let's just return and do a landing. And he was smart enough to say to me, what's wrong? I said, well, there's a little bit of oil on the wing that I'd like to look at. A little bit. That was my fib. It was a huge black stain coming over the wing. What had happened was the mechanic hadn't properly secured the oil cap on the top of the engine, and was not on the pre-flight list. So we actually put a piece of tape down on the laminated pre-flight and wrote in check oil cap. That's how you learn. Fortunately, not real serious, because we were able just to turn right around, come back in and land, and it did not do any damage to the engine. But had we gone out into the field, we probably would have lost our right engine at some point. It would have been not happy. So we saved the school a lot of money by my being very watchful in flight.
Well, it could have been a door.
Those actually are easier to close in flight than most people realize. Not so when you're pressurized and at altitude, if you're a commercial jet, but if it's a small airplane, yeah, you actually turn the airplane sideways into the wind, and the one that's out of the wind you can open and reshut.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Done that many times. Sometimes photographers would want an unobstructed view.
Yes.
And
oh, yeah.
I've even been in airplanes noisy as all get out with a door removed, and they still fly fine. There's many things involved.
In our television helicopter pilots, in a normal basis in San Diego, would take the door off for the photographer, and photographer just sits looking out.
Yeah,
puts his feet on the skids and holds on to the camera.
He has to not have a fear of heights.
Oh yeah. Oh yes.
See, that would scare the living daylights out of me back in the day.
I used to kid the photographers and say I couldn't do this.
Yeah, that's not easy. But there are lots of. I couldn't be a window washer. I might be able to now, but I couldn't then. And I did work at it, and the test that I promised people when I started working on it, because I did it very publicly, I said, I'm going to cure this. I'm going to get over this fear, because it's not grounded in anything other than a fear of falling. And I said, I'll climb on the roof of the house, and I'll have Bill take a picture of me on the roof. And so we did. We climbed up on the roof with cameras, and I took a lot of pictures looking down on Saguaro and other things. It was in Tucson that I did that. But yeah. So that was a piece. The airplane was around me. I was fine.
Wow.
And the lack of depth perception. See the trees, and I'd know where I was, or buildings, and I'd know where I was in reference to the ground.
Oh boy.
So yeah. And I'm sure that there are times that I am very cautious making a left turn, and I always err on the side of caution.
I always am.
And my husband will take turns that just I shudder, because I can't see how close or how far the car is, and I'm often surprised at how long it takes that car to hit the intersection, because I don't trust me.
Wow.
I have good enough depth perception to pass the test that Florida gives on it, because they do give a depth test.
Yeah.
I can pass that one, but I'm a little fuzzy on the one the Air Force gives. I know how to pass it. I've been taught how to pass it, but it's not because I see the depth.
Okay.
So we do learn to compensate. And that just is part of what makes each of us uniquely different and perfectly human. So again, welcome to this week of 2024. Those of you coming to Morningside for the Martin Luther King event on Monday, I will see you there, or you will see me there.
All right. Sounds good. All right. Have a good week.
You too. This is Rabbi Shafir Lobb for Congregation Eitz Chayim, your Jewish home on the Treasure Coast.
You've been listening to Ask a Rabbi right here on WPSL, Port St. Lucie. Talking the Treasure Coast, webcaster of the world.
This is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by O'Reilly Auto Parts.
I'm Steve Kaif, and the scrutiny ratchets up for a jet maker dealing with questions after what was nearly a mid-flight disaster. CBS's Christopher Cruz.
The FAA today said it will intensify its oversight of Boeing's aircraft production. The announcement came a week after a panel blew off one of the company's new 737 MAX 9 jetliners being flown by Alaska Airlines. The agency wants to know if the door plug was manufactured to meet the design approved by regulators.
Overseas, American warplanes led the way in strikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen. National security researcher Bradley Martin at the RAND Corporation.
The message should be clear. When we said there would be consequences, we meant that there would be consequences.
Consequences for an increased number of attacks by the Iranian-backed forces.